And we're so glad to have Chuck DeGroat, author of When Narcissism Comes to Church. And specifically, it's understanding the connections to emotional and spiritual abuse, which personally I think is such a needed resource for today. And so we're glad to have you, Chuck, and you are currently a professor of counseling in Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, and also co-founder and senior fellow at New Begin House of Studies in San Francisco. And also a licensed therapist, author, retreat leader, and spiritual director. And so we're glad to have you and to learn from you and with you. And for those of you who are on our call today, if you don't know what Safe Church Ministry is, we are an agency of the Christian Reformed Church in North America, and it's our role to equip congregations in abuse awareness, prevention, and response. And so we do that in a whole host of different ways, and depend in large part to many members who are a part of the Christian Reformed Church and are leading Safe Church in different areas across North America. And many of our Safe Church coordinators are with us on this call as well. And so welcome to you as well. Before we officially begin, I'd like to start with a word of prayer. So please pray with me. Triune God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the beauty of spring. And in so many places in North America, we're seeing incredible flowers and beauty, and it's a reflection of your kingdom. And so we thank you for your beauty amidst a challenging set of circumstances that we're in right now. And so we pray that you continue to be with us, Spirit, especially as we talk about emotional and spiritual abuse and its connection to narcissism. And we're thankful for Chuck DeGroat and the way that you have led him and guided him over the years. And so we pray that we're able to learn more together so that we can go forward better as the church, representing your kingdom, representing the beauty of who you are. And so we thank you, Jesus, for your grace. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
So, Chuck, I was really happy to read this book. And while I was about partway through it, and there was a reference to leaving Egypt, which was that the first book you wrote? I'm not sure. Anyway, you wrote it in 2011. Yeah. And I didn't connect that you were the author of that book as well. So that was a book about comparing leaving Egypt to a healing journey. It's a really good paradigm for thinking about a healing journey. And it was very helpful to me at the time I read it in my own healing journey. And you've written several other books as well. But I want to ask you why you wrote this book and why you think this is an important time to be talking about narcissism.
Yeah, it's such a different book than Leaving Egypt, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think people could probably discern the threads between them, but this is just an extension of my own journey and my own work. It began years ago as a seminary student, being called out on my own arrogance and certainty. That was, I think I was 27 at the time. And I was encouraged to get into counseling, which I did immediately. And I was encouraged actually to get into a mental health counseling program back then, which I did alongside my Master of Divinity. And that's like one of the single most important things I've ever done. That 2 years was transformational in terms of facing my own stuff, which is a significant part of this journey. Like as we're talking about narcissism, it's really easy to talk about the other person. But it had to begin with my own journey. And of course, then with the counseling degree and doing therapy, your eyes are opened up to all kinds of different dynamics. And in the denomination I used to be in, I was involved pretty early on in the church planting world and seeing these kinds of dynamics and thinking, why are some of the most gifted, charismatic, influential, successful, all these things that we think are great things, why do there seem to also be stories of emotional and spiritual abuse and bullying and things like? Well, that's where it began for me. And it 5 years into my work, I started doing psychological assessments. I've been doing those for the last 15 plus years. And that's where I really began to see that for pastors, by and large, like the large majority of them are somewhere in what we call cluster B personality disorders, which are the, I call narcissism the umbrella of cluster B personality disorders. And it's just, it's the numbers, I mean, I'm talking like 70, 80%. It's pretty staggering. And so it was all that work, and then doing consulting for churches, pastors saying to me, hey, we need a resource. We need something to explain this and why we're experiencing the dynamics of abuse, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, why we feel crazy. Why is this happening in the church of all places?
Yeah, I think we work a lot, with sexual abuse. People think of Safe Church related to sexual abuse, but I see the whole emotional abuse in these patterns as creating a context for that. So that's, yeah. And it's harder to define, but it's kind of like, well, you know it when you see it kind of thing. So yeah, so we're really thankful that you've written about it.
Right? I mean, you see it, you all see it, but there's plenty of sexual abuse in these stories.
Yes.
Too, how power is abused in a variety of different ways to lure folks in, oftentimes women at the hands of male pastors or male leaders who have spiritual authority. So we see the whole gamut of abuse, sadly.
Yeah. So when Eric first told me about this book and recommended that I read it, my first reaction just to the title was not good, because I feel like narcissism is such an overused term, and you've got everyone and your brother out there, labeling people, like you said, the other, a narcissist, and you forget that we're not qualified to make this diagnosis. And, and that's without even mentioning our current president in the US. And so just the whole, it's just such an overused term. And I didn't even want to read the book because it had that in the title. so it's, I just want to hear, again, kind of, why did you choose that title, and how do you look at narcissism in a broader way than the way we throw it around like that? Or how do we get away from doing that too? That's another thing.
Yeah, I think that's so good. And right at the very beginning, I'm thinking about that with the reader. Like we toss the word around, and it's become a caricature, and we by and large use it pretty irresponsibly, or it becomes a kind of definitive label. And I worry about that too, that we reduce people down to a label, a diagnosis, whether it's addict or narcissist or even sinner, as if that represents the core of who we are at our depths. At our depths, we're image bearers. That's first. And so I try to hold that tension, and it's a hard one to hold. One of the things that I try to deal with in there is that when we're talking about narcissism, we're not always talking about narcissistic personality disorder. Mm-hmm. There's a spectrum. Narcissistic type, style, and disorder. And I get into this in a lot more depth. I won't get into the details of it, but the big idea is that there are a good number of us who have narcissistic traits, and we may even be emotionally healthy and self-aware enough to know that that we're being tugged in a particular direction. When we talk about narcissistic personality disorder, there's very little, really no self-awareness at all, very little curiosity. And that's what marks, that's the difference, right? There may be a good number of us who have narcissistic traits, but we may be willing to understand how we've impacted someone else, or how we're coming across, or how we've hurt someone, or even bullied, or whatever it might be. But when we talk about narcissistic personality disorder, we see real damage, a real debris field of damage in the church. The conversation in some ways first began in the Catholic Church as you look at the sexual abuse scandals, and you wonder how could this happen, and how could the hierarchy protect these priests, and yet the same things are happening in the Protestant church across denominations. And so, yeah, it's not a happy topic, but we've got to take it seriously.
Absolutely. And I found it fascinating the way you were able to understand more about narcissism within the individual. and then relate it a little bit more to the narcissistic systems that we're swimming in some ways, in which you put it, and also the society in which we all live in. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how you've related the individual to the institution of the church also being narcissist in some ways, or having a lot of narcissism that's alive and well.
Yeah. I think I started to learn that lesson before I even began to understand systemic dynamics. I think I learned that lesson seeing like on the ground the work with narcissistic leaders, and realizing that you could remove a narcissistic leader from a church and still have some of the same dynamics at work in the church, in the denomination, in the institution. And so, yeah, a lot of the same kind of like characteristics or diagnostic categories, things like that you describe an individual with, you could describe institutions with. And for instance, one of the ones that rises to the surface is a sense of grandiosity. You see this in a narcissistic individual. I alone am special. I alone deserve the stage. You know, they preach 51 weeks a year, you know, and they've always got to be up front. And then I begin to do work with a ministry that may or may not be led by a narcissistic leader. And this ministry that touts its values, its mission, following Christ, is a ministry that talks about other ministries in demeaning ways. You know, it's a ministry that says we alone are the ministry that can provide the programs and the resources to help you with blah, 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 right? And so then you see some of the same characteristics in a large organization, and all of these, of course, even among Christians. And that becomes at least part of the conversation that's so disruptive to so many folks. Because when you think about this in a corporation, some institution, secular institution or something like that, it can be understandable to people. But for followers of Jesus, you know, the humble, suffering servant, it makes less sense. Like, why are these dynamics alive and at work among Christians, Christian organizations, institutions, in the church? Why do we see instances of spiritual abuse and emotional abuse? And why are the stories not isolated, but I mean, the stories are all over the place and cross-denominational, right?
Right.
That's when it becomes really disturbing, I think.
And I think many of us think of these grandiose, types of people, and you kind of translate that to systems, but you also talk about this vulnerable type of narcissism, which I didn't quite understand as much, before I read your book. I'm wondering if you'd talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, so there's not a one size fits all, right? So when we're talking about narcissism, we can kind of take the DSM-5 diagnosis. That's like the Bible of psychologists, right? That's where you find these diagnostic categories. And we read diagnostic categories like grandiosity and a sense of entitlement, need for attention, and disruptions in family and work relationships, and all those kinds of things. And that's where the caricature that Bonnie was talking about comes into play. It must be that guy, that politician, that person on stage. It can be male or female, by the way, but the stats weigh more heavily toward men. It must be that person that always needs to be up front. And yet we see it with folks who don't necessarily need the big stage, but yet manifest some of the same dynamics of manipulation. I mean, so it's not maybe a grandiose superiority, I'll say, but more of a smug superiority. I was doing some work, by the way, when I tell stories, I always try to change details and things. So if you're thinking, I know what church he's talking about, you don't. But working with a church in the Midwest, it was a very small church, and it prided itself on being small, in fact. And the congregation, the pastor would say things like, we are the true church. We're the only church that faithfully follows Jesus. We're the only church that faithfully maintains orthodoxy. That church doesn't, that church doesn't, that church doesn't. And all these were demonstrations of a more vulnerable kind of narcissism. It's not as spectacular. It's not as grandiose. It's less visible. It's more smug. And yet it's nonetheless, well, it's it's in every way just as potent, just as toxic, just as destructive.
Right. Yeah. And, I guess individually, I also like the way that you incorporated the Enneagram into your book. Over the past 4 years, I found the Enneagram to be this tool that was just so helpful for me. When I finally came to understand that I was actually a 1 on the Enneagram, I honestly broke down and I cried for a little while. I just was like, no, this can't be. But then all of this stuff, from my childhood and family of origin and why I put on, that certain mask, it all of a sudden came to bear. And I just appreciated the way you use this tool. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about how the faces of narcissism show up, not just in one of the Enneagram numbers, but it's actually a part of kind of all of them, as the kind of the gut center or the head center or the heart center. All of them relate to this, all of these things that are connected to narcissism.
Yeah, well, really, the roots of the Enneagram go all the way back to the early church fathers and mothers, and the 7 deadly sins, which by some accounts were 8 deadly sins, by other accounts were 9 deadly sins. And I don't happen to think that there's some underground secret Enneagram society that's been kind of running with this since the 300. But I do think that there's a kind of basic wisdom that it plays off of, a basic sort of early understanding, theological understanding of core passions, core sufferings. I think each one of the Enneagram type describes a kind of core suffering. And in the midst of our individual struggles with that core suffering, we try to adapt, we try to cope, we try to get our needs met. And these ways of getting our needs met are problematic. They become sinful strategies to get what we really long for apart from Jesus. And I think any sinful strategy has the capacity to be narcissistic, right? This is why the narcissism conversation, people are like, well, how long has it been around the church? And I'm like, since Genesis 3, it's been around a long, long time. And it sort of surfaces in different ways, shapes, and forms throughout the history of the church. The Enneagram now gives us a tool to talk about these different ways that it manifests. And so, you've already confessed to being a 1, an Enneagram type 1, and oftentimes we see a narcissistic perfectionism in a 1, need to be right. You think about how that need to be right, and we're not talking about Eric right now because he's done some of his work, but where this shows up in people who are particularly sort of pathological and not self-aware, and this need to be right all the time, the need to be perfect, people who are constantly perfecting others. We talk about Enneagram type 3s, always need to succeed. They always need to be on top, long to have the stage, long to be in the spotlight. Sometimes we talk about Enneagram type 5s. I'm just skipping numbers now, who long for kind of intellectual certainty. And so always need to be in the know, and can have a sort of condescending feel when you're around them because they always know better, and so on and so forth. And these ways, these styles of relating emerge out of core needs, core sufferings, really, and core ways of getting needs met. And so I end up talking about 9 faces of narcissism, which I say in the book. This is suggestive on my part, and I'm being playful in this chapter. I'm trying to say this is what I've seen in 20 years of working with the Enneagram, because I was introduced to it back in 1997 at the beginning of my own clinical program. 23 years of working with the Enneagram and working with these diagnostic categories. I see a ton of overlap with these Enneagram types and narcissism. You feel free to ask any deeper questions in on that, but that's the overview.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's good to know we're in the presence of a sage Enneagram master. I'm just thinking, so often, it's become a hot topic over the past several years. And sometimes you think, oh, as the evangelical church has kind of taken this and used it, and so now that they have, it's become a Jesus thing, when in fact it's been a part of so many different cultures of people learning to understand themselves in a greater way, and I think is that the cure then for narcissism? Like what, just diving inward then.
Yeah, I mean, so the cure for narcissism, that's so loaded, right? What does that mean? And of course, this is a healing journey we go on. So we could take that in so many different directions. There are those who've been hurt by narcissism, right?
Yeah.
Who may be in a conversation like this, just beginning to become aware of how they've been hurt by narcissistic abuse, spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. And that journey may just begin with a basic awareness that comes from a conversation like this. Like maybe that's the reason I feel so crazy. I think for those of us who identify ourselves along that, spectrum of 9 types in the Enneagram, who are looking at our own narcissism, like I did, 20 some odd years ago when I was called out as a seminary student, I was so blind to my strategies. This is not just sinful behavior. And I think sometimes when we talk about sin, we reduce it down to behavior. We're talking about a whole strategy for relating. Sometimes when people talk to me about these things, they're like, your view of sin is too shallow. And I'm like, oh no, let's go deeper and deeper and deeper. Let's not just get down to the peccadillos, the behaviors. Let's get down to how you relate. Let's actually go further and get at what motivates you to relate in particular kinds of ways. And that's what the Enneagram actually does for us. And so when that's revealed to you that, the Enneagram 4, which I identify with, longs to be seen as special, unique, and authentic, and deep. For you to say what you just said to me, well, that strokes me in a particular kind of way, right? Oh, sure. Finally I'm seen. And if I rest in that, if that becomes the core source of my identity, that, Eric sees me and thinks that I'm special and has something to offer, well, then how shallow will I be? And then how will I use that to get my needs met in other kinds of ways too, right? And so it begins with a basic self-awareness. Like I ought to, like you, be slayed by that reality in myself.
Yeah, and I think that's also what I appreciate about your book, is that you invite the reader, all of us, to not just point the finger out there at all the things that we recognize in other people about, that are narcissistic, but it's actually starting with ourselves. It's being able to say, how can I work on myself and be a part of the fix? And so yeah, again, thank you for inviting us on this greater journey that we can take. And I think, part of my hope is that we can do that together with others as a part of the church, so that we can go together as a covenant community.
Yeah, there's a lot swimming in my mind right now. One thing too is thinking about the CRC culture, and when you were talking about some of those, needing to be right, being intellectual, things like that, we can look at our culture as well as ourselves. But one of the challenges that Safe Church Ministry faces is creating safe spaces where people can take that journey, where we can take an honest look at ourselves and be honest with other people about what's really going on in our lives, where you can express struggles and doubts, where we can challenge one another. And I know in your book you talk, well, probably because you're a therapist, you talk about the value of doing that in a therapeutic relationship, a professional relationship. You also talk about the value of spiritual direction. And I've benefited from both of those things myself, but I think there's a lot of us that maybe don't have the resources to spend years in therapy or with a spiritual direction person. And I do think there is a role for lay people in walking alongside. So can you say something more about that, maybe how we as a church could help create places where it's safer to take that inward look, and where it's safer to be honest about what's really going on?
Yeah, and maybe even to switch up the language, where we can be more courageous and where we can be more brave, because I think it's tough. Even in a therapeutic relationship, when I do counseling, it takes a while for someone to feel safe. And that's a one-on-one relationship, But if you've experienced sexual abuse and trauma, I've worked with dozens, if not hundreds of women over the years who've been sexually abused. As a male, and a male with some authority, right? A reverend or a doctor next to your name. If you've been sexually abused by a male, perhaps a male in power in some way or another, it might take you a year, 2 years to maybe begin to feel safe with me, you know? And so when we talk about church as a safe place, boy, it's really tough, you know? And I remember I was influenced back in the day by Larry Crabb's writings. And Crabb, years and years ago, wrote a book called The Safest Place on Earth about the church. He was really committing to do this work in the church. And then he committed to it. And then he realized, oh, it's not as safe as I thought it was. There's so much pain. There's so much trauma. Even when well-intentioned folks like all of us are trying to do what we can do, trying to create these spaces. And so it really takes a village to be cliche here. You know, it takes all of us playing our unique roles. You know, for a pastor to think, I've worked with plenty of pastors, by the way, who thought, I've got training in therapy, spiritual direction, my MDiv, I will create that space, only to be exhausted 2 or 3 years later, working so hard and exhausting themselves in the process of trying to create a space that didn't end up being as safe as they thought it would be. In terms of accessibility, I think you're onto something there. And I think, you know, one of the things I did when I was pastoring out in San Francisco was almost immediately begin working with a diaconate there to help them understand that the role of the diaconate is, in some cases, the diaconate simply sees themselves as like providing money to people in need, you know, cutting checks. And I wanted a really empowered diaconate that would actually, where we therapists and pastors would be working with people at maybe deeper emotional and spiritual levels, but where they would be working on a whole host of needs to get them sort of back on their feet, to get them into good employment, to get them the mental health care that they need, to make sure that they're working with budgets that they can handle, you know. And so we actually empowered the diaconate to sort of work at multiple levels of people's stories and journeys and pain, so that we could work sort of in tandem with therapists and pastors on the whole person. And I think that's how churches need to start looking at this. Not everyone can afford therapy. Not everyone has access to the kinds of medications that they need. And so how do we work with alternative strategies to meet people's needs?
Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, I know I've done some small groups with, you know, survivors, small groups, and that's been really a wonderful place where I've seen God work and where you can see his healing power at work. So yeah, just encouraging more places like that help people take that look inside is really important.
Yeah, it sounds too that you're mentioning that it's good to understand perhaps the limitations of that spiritual community, which may be, you know, a key part of narcissism as well, to say that we actually do have these limitations. And if we were to try to go beyond and create the space that's going to be healing for everyone, it may actually be outside of the capacity that we have at the time, or where the Spirit may be actually calling us to be his church.
Yeah, that's it. And there are, I'm sure on a call like this, a lot of well-meaning people who are, you know, it's those of us who are on calls like this who are pressing into these places who so often neglect our own needs, right? And there can be even a latent narcissism there. Like, you know, I know I've got needs, but your needs are more important, Bonnie, you know? And I think, you know, I turned 50 this year, and I think the older I get, the more I recognize my own fragility and my own neediness, like a deep level of neediness that it seems like year after year, it's like, wow, that river runs deeper than I thought it did. I'm more tired, I'm more needy, I'm more frail, I'm more fragile. And so for those of us who are caring, to be aware of the cost of caring, right? And to recognize, and I think that's what happened as then a veteran pastor moving from my work in Orlando as a pastor to San Francisco. Maybe I knew a little bit better at that point because I exhausted myself in Orlando. By the time I got to San Francisco, I was like, oh, I can't do this alone. I need a team. I need a diaconate. I need other staff. And I started training our elders. I got our elders and our deacons. And, I was just like, all of you need to know what we're doing. This is not going to be like centralized care. We need to do this together. And then, then you've got mentors and friends who can walk alongside people who have access in a way maybe a therapist or a pastor doesn't have access.
Right. Yeah. How do we go together as a community with all the different aspects and the way that the Spirit has gifted all of us? And I think we will soon get to some of the questions that we have had from a variety of our participants. But I also wanted to say that a notable chapter for me was when you started to describe gaslighting, or you titled the chapter, "The Gaslight is On." And you share the story of this young budding church planter who'd raised this substantial amount of money, and he was in this psychological assessment with you. And I'll say I've been in that space as one of the church planters, about 5 years ago when we were starting a church plant. And it was, I'll say it wasn't a large focus, or it was more of a neighborhood community development type of church plant. But at the same time, as I'm honest, like as I was reading this book, there was parts of me, that became uneasy. And I realized that I too still have a variety of these different narcissistic tendencies. And you end with a chapter called "Transformation for Narcissists is Possible." I'm just sharing, as we wrap up and go to some of the questions, what other hope is there that you can share with us today, especially during a time where so many people are feeling added anxiety in this cultural moment that we're in?
This is where I think this book kind of will take you on a journey where you feel like bounced from one side to the other, because here you mentioned gaslighting and this reality that so many of us have experienced. I've experienced multiple times where I've asked the question, am I crazy? Is there something wrong? Am I not seeing something here? This really intentional strategy that some narcissistic abusers use to sort of make people question their reality, right? How does he include a chapter on transformation for narcissists is possible? And that really gets it, by the way. In fact, I use that paradigm from Leaving Egypt too in there, but it really gets at this idea that when we talk about narcissism, that people are in different places along the spectrum. And I would say really clearly that when we're dealing with narcissistic personality disorder as a diagnosable pathology that is maybe confirmed by interviews, an interview that I would do where I realized there is no curiosity whatsoever. Like in the story that I tell in there, there's zero curiosity. In fact, I'm going to start questioning you and throwing you under the bus. It's really hard to see transformation. We don't see transformation. We mitigate damage at that point. But for those of us who have narcissistic characteristics, a lot of us in ministry, a lot of us who write books or go on stage or preach week in and week out, again, the large majority of my assessments show people on some kind of narcissistic spectrum. To be aware of how that plays out. And the question that I love for people to ask, leaders to ask, is how do you experience me? It's a question that people in my life are free to respond to. People who work for me, my students, how do you experience me? So that a student before COVID, when we were still in residence, a student comes to me one day and says, hey, remember that question you like to ask, Chuck? Can I give you some feedback? And the dreaded, what happens inside your soul when someone says that, right? I invite them up to my office and he tentatively says, I've experienced you as really distant. And every time you're walking through the atrium over at Western, you're walking really fast. It always seems like you've got something to do and someplace to go. And it seems like you're sort of too important to take my question. Wow. Okay. So then how do we listen well to people who give us their experience of us? And then engage that, own that, repent of it, but also see it as a larger pattern. Well, how's this played out in other ways and in other relationships? How do we take those things seriously?
Creating that space where people can enter into that conversation.
Yeah. So that when someone comes to me or to you, someone in authority, and they expect to be intimidated or perhaps bullied, we're actually then empowering them. I say, no, tell me more. Tell me more about how you experienced me and how it was hard. And we actually draw them out, you know. That's a gift that we give to folks.
Right. And I want to introduce Becky Jones as well. She's a staff person of Safe Church Ministry, currently in Canada. And we have a variety of questions that have come in through the chat. And so Becky, take it away.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to try and get to as many questions as we can. So, hello, Chuck. My first question that we received was, do you know any seminaries that are screening their seminarians before, during, or at the end of their MDiv programs for narcissism spectrum traits?
Yeah, that's a good question. Very few are doing it that I'm familiar with. There are, for instance, at the seminary where I teach at Western, there are a variety of different ways that we get at this. We did do testing for a long time. We're not doing it anymore for reasons that are too complicated to get into right now. We've got other ways of sort of engaging that process, providing counseling, making counseling at least free for 6 sessions or cost efficient, doing a number of different reviews along the way of students. But in terms of actually doing this kind of assessing, it's pretty rare. I do a lot of the assessing for something in the Reformed Church of America called the Ministerial Formation and Credentialing Agency, where every student that comes from another seminary into the RCA has to do a pretty thorough psychological assessment with me or someone else. And again, that's really rare. We do it a bit more sometimes when people get involved in church planting. But there again, it's more rare. And so this is something that I'd like to see become standard. It's oftentimes something where seminaries feel like they don't have the expertise, or in the case of many seminaries, it costs a lot of money to pay a psychologist to do an assessment for a lot of different students. And in a time when seminaries are losing students and we're trying to figure out cost-cutting measures, it can be the first thing that goes away sometimes, sadly.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense, though.
Yeah.
The next question is, can you speak about the tensions between calling, legitimate exercise of authority, and abuse of power, and how churches can put in place checks and balances to avoid appeals to authority to excuse tendency to narcissism?
Sheesh. This one's really hard because oftentimes, I'll do a lot of work, consulting work with non-denominational networks and structures like that, where they'll say, oh, this probably doesn't happen in denominations, does it? And here we all are, like 4 denominational people who are like, yeah, it happens in denominations. I think structures are really helpful. I don't think structures are the end all be all. I was in a different denomination when I experienced narcissistic abuse. And I remember the narcissistic leadership being protected. Sometimes there are what we call old boys clubs that come in and protect a sort of a favored son of the denomination or someone who has particular influence. And then there are other times where it's just sort of like, oh, it couldn't be him, it couldn't be her. Not after 30 years of fruit, not after fill in the blank, right? And so there's not a very easy answer to that question. Because it can't be reduced down to structures. Oftentimes it takes leaders who have integrity, who are over those structures and within those structures, and who are able to call people to integrity within those structures, but even then things get missed. And I don't say that to be hopeless, but it really comes back to that earlier question about the church being safe. For as well-intentioned as we are, these things will occasionally break down, even for me in therapeutic relationships, people wouldn't always feel as protected as they wanted to feel protected by me or as a pastor. It breaks down in so many different levels. Yeah, we keep trying, we keep pressing in, we long for leaders with integrity like you all who are engaged in conversations like this.
Okay. Thanks.
As a follow-up to that, Chuck, I'm just thinking, oftentimes we as a church, I think, wait until the worst possible scenario when the devastation is just so apparent and there's no other, reason or, consequence than to put the person on administrative leave. And I'm just curious about the connections between sexual abuse that happens and kind of the red flags that happen before it gets to that place. The emotional abuse, the spiritual abuse that takes place.
Yeah, you're right. Because when we see these things happen, generally, those of us who do this kind of work know that 100 things had to happen before this to get here, right? Things were overlooked, concerns were not honored, structures were not in place, alarm bells were not heeded to, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is why I think I was praising you guys before we got on. Safe Church is I think, a means to this end here. What we're looking at here is developing systems and to get back to structures where there is a more fundamental integrity, right? So we don't get to a place of crisis. And, people are availing themselves more and more of things like Jerry Scazzaro from New York, right there, work on emotionally healthy church and spirituality, resources like that. I point people to a ministry called Grace, Godly Response in Abusive Environments. They've got all sorts of curriculum and resources, and they're old friends of mine who are engaged in this kind of work, much like you're doing. A lot of it is educational, right? Psychoeducational kind of work. Here are things to look out for. Here are warning signs. Here are ways of making your church safe for children. Here are things to look out for in psychological, emotional dynamics, to look out for in relationships. And so if we're attentive to those kinds of things and really intentional as pastors, and by the way, it feels like a lot of work. When I talk to pastors, when I talk to my MDiv students, it's like, oh, really? Do we have to do that? I thought I just got to go in and preach every Sunday, and it's like, yes, really. And the work is harder, but it's more beautiful than you know. And it requires you to engage these things very, very intentionally.
Yeah, I think that's where often before, like, the Me Too movement, I think we felt challenged to get this conversation rolling. And now it's so easy for us to enter into a conversation and to realize that this is gospel ministry at its core. And we hope that the good news of the kingdom is able to even more come in abundance, and more flourishing is able to take place. And that's a part of our role. Even though when I talk to pastors, I'm like, I know you're so busy. I know things are just, it can feel like it's overwhelming already, but this is so significant. And so, yeah, we're thankful for your voice and for people like employed at Grace. And we actually just talked to Boz Chavidian just before this call. Bonnie and I were talking to him. And also thankful for the way that at the end of your chapters in your book, you actually point to all of these other resources like Pete Scazzaro and the Emotionally Healthy Church. And also Diane Langberg was another person in book that you have in there. And she has a great book coming out this coming fall on power and abuse of power. So yeah, we appreciate all of those.
Wade Mullen, it's not in the book because it's new. He's got a book coming out on narcissistic organizations, toxic organizations, Diane Langberg, Grace. There's so many good resources. And so in the midst of this Me Too movement, where we feel a little bit like paralyzed by everything that's going on, I hear that sometimes from pastors, like, I don't know what to do, and I feel like I'm in the crossfire. Take a deep breath, relax, and then reach out to Bonnie. Reach out to Eric, be intentional, and begin to engage a conversation. Just curiosity is a really wonderful thing, and it comes alongside humility. And as we engage that, we realize, oh, there are all sorts of really good resources, and it just requires a little effort on my part, and all shall be well.
All righty. There was one comment that I thought I'd throw back at you, Chuck. One person said the cost of evaluation for seminaries, but the cost of not doing it is so huge. So I thought that was very important to mention. And then another question that's just come up that I just wanted to check in with you is, are you available for counseling? And if yes, is there a contact we can share?
Yeah, so I do counseling consultation. You can imagine with the book and everything like that. My own practice is full. I have a sort of a team. They're not my team. They're really people I trust who I don't get any money. I don't get anything. I have good referrals, in other words, to people who do this kind of work. If you need that kind of referral, and yeah, I do occasionally do consultations with churches and. Where we go in and we do a little bit of a deeper dive, because when you're dealing with an institution, organization, you've got to go below the surface of like what just happened and get at more fundamental structures and mental models and things like that, and patterns and so forth. And so I do that kind of work too. But I also have others that I can point you all to that do that work. They're really good folks like you all doing this work, often behind the scenes. And if only we would just sort of avail ourselves of the resources, they're there.
A second question come in relation to that was even just, do you know of communities that are just connecting, like pastors that are connecting to form sort of a self-awareness group together that you could point people towards? Yeah,
nothing like here's I was going to say an AOL chat room. That just dates me right there. That's how it all began, people, with the AOL chat rooms. But nothing like that where I could point to like here's a particular forum. I mean, I'm seeing this happen more organically as pastors are engaging these conversations with one another and really partnering with one another denominationally through Safe Church and other places like that where connections are made. Grace and other things like that. So one of the things that a number of us are talking about right now is how do we connect the work? In other words, it feels like, so-and-so's doing this over here, Diane and Boz Davidian and Allison Cook and Chuck over here. And so some of us are thinking about how do we align more closely. And I don't know what that looks like, but I'm kind of thinking at this stage of my own journey in life and work that I'd really love to see us come around one another. I don't have anything official to tell you right now, though, about that.
Okay, thanks. We'll keep you updated if we hear stuff from you. So another question I had is, I'd love to hear is, how do you define spiritual abuse? And then how do you talk about it within your church so that people don't get defensive about it?
Oof, yeah. Well, so, when we talk about emotional abuse first, we talk about an abuse where there are not physical scars, right? We're talking about emotional, psychological bruises and wounding, years and years and years of psychological knives poked in the side of a wife married to an abusive husband who demeans her, who insults her, who questions her. 15, 20 years into the marriage, she bears all kinds of scars that are not physical. Spiritual abuse layers on top of emotional abuse. And I think about it in terms of now we're dealing with emotional abuse with spiritual authority behind it. So now it's your pastor, it's a mentor, it's a spiritual father or mother in your life. It's someone who we think has some, we just tragically a couple of months ago found out about Jean Vanier and how he abused trust at L'Arche. And he was a hero of mine. I mean, I had his picture up in my first pastoral office. And that's a form of spiritual abuse that is layered with emotional abuse and sexual abuse. I mean, there's scars upon scars upon scars, right? But often with spiritual abuse, it's a twist of the knife that's really subtle. Oh, you don't, Becky, you don't read scripture every day? I wonder why that is, Now, by the way, I don't know anything about Becky's spiritual life but oh gosh, Becky, I wonder why you're not engaging your quiet times as faithfully as you should, and it comes with a should, or it comes with an ought, or it comes with an expectation. It comes with the sense that I'm condescending, you know, I'm talking down to you. I'm not empowering you. I'm not coming alongside you. I'm not empathizing. So it can be as subtle as that. How do you get churches to begin talking about these kinds of things? That's a more complicated question, because we have to ask the question, what's the resistance to it in the first place? And oftentimes, you know, my experience in Dutch Reformed cultures, we don't talk about these things because we're polite with one another, because we don't want to talk about hard things. We don't want to talk about invisible things. We want to talk about sin as that bad thing you did. You committed adultery. We don't want to talk about like all the stuff behind that, you know? So what's keeping us from having the conversation? What's the resistance is my question.
Thank you very much.
And just related to that a little bit, I think of the narratives that we tell ourselves as part of our culture. Like you were saying, being polite, you know, you don't air your dirty laundry, you don't, you know, you keep family things, just all those narratives. You know, that's where when you start thinking about culture or system change, you have to first identify those narratives so you can change those first. And they're very hard if they're part of your belief system. That's been part of that culture for a long time.
I was doing a consultation with a church just a couple of weeks ago where I said, what are the family rules in your church staff and your church over the course of your 30 years of being on staff? And they were like, there aren't any family rules. There aren't, like, really? There are no stories you tell yourselves about who you are and what you do and how valuable you are and what we don't talk about, what we do talk about. Once you open that can of worms, you know this, Bonnie. I mean, once you open that can of worms, then they start talking about, oh, there are all kinds of dynamics and rules and implicit beliefs and assumptions. And so, yeah, just going down that road actually is like, that's one of the first things I do when I start consulting. And oftentimes what I say when I teach on this stuff is like, once you get below the waterline, if you imagine this like a big iceberg, they're like, can we stop paying you for consulting now? Like, because this is way more complicated than we thought it was. Like we dismissed the pastor. We thought you'd come in and tell us we did a good job and that we shouldn't hire someone like him again. But we didn't know that it had to do with all this yuck underneath.
Go for it, Eric.
Oh, sorry, Becky. I was just going to say that's so often, you know, I think why we try to approach abuse prevention along the lines of a cultural and systemic change, and it takes a long time. And the long process of becoming aware of all of these different narratives that we are a part of, and understanding that it's not just that person, the quick scapegoat, but it's actually something, you know, that we've enabled it in a variety of degrees.
It's why we avoid conversations about systemic racism as well, right? So it's the same reason why we avoid conversations about spiritual abuse. It's the same reason why it's nice that we have a person with a wheelchair in our congregation, but we don't want to talk about disability systemically and the structures that, you know, like we avoid those conversations because they require too much of us. But I mean, I think this is, as Reformed people, if we want to have a serious doctrine of sin, we've got to talk about sin not only individually, but embedded in these kinds of systems that enable, right? And so, again, this is a journey of humility. And if we're going to talk about healing, it begins with humility and how am I a participant in it? And, you know, that's just so hard. I don't want to see myself as a participant. I want to see myself as someone who now has like with narcissism, now I have a new category and I can scapegoat you because I know what narcissism means and I can call you this word, you know, rather than saying, no, actually I participated in those systems.
So I'm thinking time for one more question. So I'm going to throw in that's a little bit, has a few parts to it. So the first part is the relationship. What do you think the relationship is between narcissism and empathy? And then added to that is, can narcissism actually be a deep vulnerability or inadequacy that drives that behavior?
Yeah, this is a big part of the book. I try to get underneath it, like to open the hood and to say what's going on underneath, you know, and you know, where we see narcissism, we inevitably see a story of shame. disconnection, invulnerability, not vulnerability, but invulnerability. There's a story. In other words, there's a story of pain, probably a story of abuse of some kind back in their story, you know, and the person who is diagnosably narcissistic. I remember working with one man years ago, a very successful pastor, had been founding pastor, probably 25 years. And I said, you know, there are times when I'm with you where it feels like you're just like 7 or 8 years old and you're just such a scared little boy. And I mean, the tears started coming like in a convulsive kind of way. And what I realized was then, and what I've known for a long time, and I know it from my own story as well, is that there are layers of self-protection. I don't want you to see the pain in my own heart, my own life. I don't want you to see the shame story behind my protective armor. And so anyone who's diagnosably narcissistic is hidden behind a kind of armor. And again, the question is, are you willing to go on a journey and look at that? Are you willing to look at the 7-year-old and say, golly, what happened? Why are you in such pain? So yeah, I think that's a really important question. Behind narcissism is always deep shame, deep insecurity, deep pain.
Well, we want to thank you, Chuck, for talking with us, sharing your insight, and for writing this book. And for each of you who are participating, we also invite you to a book study that we will be doing. We're going to be doing this study on Wednesdays for the next 3 weeks, so June 3rd, 10th, and the 17th. And it's all via Zoom. And so you can find that link actually in your chat box. I just sent it now. And I'm excited to continue talking and digesting this, because it takes, you know, what you mentioned, Chuck, this takes a long time. It's an invitation to go on a journey. And so thankful for you opening this up for us, and we're excited to see how we can continue to have this conversation. Yeah.
Thank you. It's good being with you.
Yeah. All right. Farewell, everyone.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank
Have a
you.
good rest of the day. Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you, friends. Take care.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much.
Bye.